What are promises and how do they work? In another video, I talked about the problem that promises are trying to solve and the ways that they were addressed, some ways that they can be addressed. But promises give you a different way of dealing with that same problem. The best way I can explain what a problem is to take a look at a real-world example. So to do that, let's take a look at this. This is a real-world example of a promise. Like a real promise, a promise can be kept or it can be broken. So let's say you go to your favorite restaurant, it's busy, you're hungry, and you go up to the desk and ask for a table for your party. Well, there's no tables available as usual, so they hand you this little device and you walk away and go continue with your business. And they go about trying to find you a table. As soon as one becomes available, they'll notify you. Now, in some rare cases, they may not be able to find you a table, and in that case, they'll notify you as well. So this is the real-world analogy of a promise. When you make a request, here's the key. When you make a request for something that gets done asynchronously, you get something in return at the point of request. That's the key concept here to understand with promises. When I ask for the table, they immediately give me something, and I walk away and I keep this thing and I get notified later. So let's keep that in mind. So how does this apply to our example here where we want to query some champions and we have an operation called a command that carries this out asynchronously? So when we make this request, it will actually do the work on another thread, and the code that calls this command actually will continue on its own thread. So it does it asynchronously. But to employ the concept here of the promise, we get something back when we make the request. So we're going to get a promise back. And this is the key difference here in handling this problem. When we make the request, the command hands us something back. It keeps a reference to the promise it hands us back so that it can notify us. So what happens here is when we make this request, as it did in the past, the query champions command will offload the actual query work to another thread, but it will return us a promise immediately. So given this promise, we can now work with it. We can tell it to notify us. So for example, on complete, and I'm not using any specific syntax here, I'm just conveying concept. So when the promise completes, I'm going to pass it a closure. And the way promises typically work is they pass along the promise that was resolved. So as an argument. And in the onComplete case, a promise can complete in one of two ways. It can either be resolved or it can be broken. So the onComplete case will be called in both cases. So I need to often interrogate the promise to see if there's an error or not. So if I want to be notified whether it completed successfully or not, then I'll want to use this sort of syntax. If instead I only want to know when it succeeds, then I'll use this sort of syntax. And then of course, if I want to know when it fails or is broken, then I want to use this sort of syntax. So given this, I can then get a promise back immediately as a response to executing an asynchronous operation, and then I can deal with it. Now, of course, all this can be simplified as this. I don't really need the promise. I can simply chain this together and just say, for example, on complete. And I could replace the on complete with an on success or an on error. So this makes a really concise way of dealing with the result of a promise. So I can say on complete or on success or on error. And it just with a simple line of code, couple lines of code here, I can deal with the results of the promise. The last thing I want to do here is to talk about something called continuation. So we've already covered this notion of responding to the results of an asynchronous operation, and we can do so in terms of an error, success, or completion. So these three things are similar, and these are generically referred to in promises as continuations. So when you hear me or someone talk about continuations, that's what this piece of the promise is.